Just to remind you, this is the last of our this semester's our growth seminar. We're going to have another very exciting series of our growth seminar in the spring, so please stay tuned. Once again, if you're not in our email list, we usually circulate a sign-up sheet, so you can put your email address down there. So we're very fortunate to have our speaker today as a very exciting topic. Tackling the roots of the crisis, the proposition of stabilizing property markets. In fact, this is the only presentation we have this semester which deals with the developing world. I'm very pleased to introduce Elena Panaritis, who is an expert in property rights. And as I understand, a disciple of Fernando de Soto, some fashion, maybe. Creating markets in liquid real estate assets and public sector management. She's currently heading Panel Group, a specialized advisory group that invests in underdeveloped property and provides counsel on transforming undervalued properties into productive real estate and really public policy. And she teaches housing finance and public policy reform with a focus on property and institutions. Some places as Wharton School, Management, University of Pennsylvania, Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, and elsewhere. So, she has been working for some years, mainly in Latin America, and for the economists of the World Bank and consulting in various countries about the property rights kinds of issues informed in Peru. Now, this is a short introduction. I may have left out a few things which Elena would fill in appropriately. Other kind of activist work. This book, Prosperity Unbound, Building Property Markets with Trust, is something available for if you'd like to buy a copy. It's available outside on the table. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our respondents. I'm very pleased and happy to have Professor Jeff Nugent from the Department of Economics. Professor Nugent is an expert in development economics, and some of our doctoral students may have taken his course. Professor Nugent is an often outside member in many of our committees. The second respondent, Professor Richardson, will not be able to join us, so I'll see if Professor Jenny Schutz is at the end. I'll see maybe I could try to, as inadequately, to fill in the place of Professor Richardson and try to put in my words. So, but anyways, our discussion time will be shorter, which will increase the Q&A time, which has been a problem in some of the previous sessions where we never had enough time for Q&A. So without much further ado, I present to you Ms. Elena Panaritis for her presentation.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here with you today. I appreciate very much the company and all these very bright young minds. I hope we will have a nice conversation. Indeed, I am all what you introduced me as, and in addition to this, I'm an institutional economist and a social entrepreneur. An institutional economist that, in practice, applies and studies how agents in the market and players in the market organize their contracts, their transactions. How can they manage to have their transactions effectively finalized, and what are the incentives that actually take them backwards, and we end up having not as effective markets. So that's basically what I'm working on, and I'm focusing in the last 18 years on how to transform illiquid property into liquid property. You may have heard the term informal property, and if you read my book, you will read another term called unreal estate. It's what I call informal or illiquid property, and I will try to explain it a little more. It is indeed an oxymoron to call real estate unreal estate, but you'll see why I'm doing that. Most of the methodology of transforming illiquid to liquid property or informal to formal has been applied in Peru, starting in the late 80s all the way through the 90s, and with a final successful result in 2001, 2002. Right now, Peru is actually applying the new system of property rights that has a great successful result. In the book Prosperity Unbound, you will also read the definition of that methodology in chapter 2, which is called reality check analysis. And you will hopefully try to understand a little better what is this animal of informal property or illiquid property. I'm sure many of us have got a better grasp at it, especially because of the crisis. But it is indeed something difficult to understand. It took me 18 years, and I'm still coping with it, and I'm going to try to transmit this in about 30 minutes. As a private, I used to work at the World Bank for about 12 years as a staff member economist at the bank, and then I decided to become a social entrepreneur where I apply this methodology with private funding around the world and within the United States. Now, as I told you, it took me a long time to understand what is to grasp informal property. We are all brought up in the West. We have been educated in the West. We understand one thing, but we have very limited feeling of what really it means and it feels to have informal property. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little trailer which I made for my book after I successfully dimmed the lights. And then it's only going to be So 3 minutes. I hope I gave you a bit of a taste of what is it. I just came from Guyana in Trinidad, and I have to just tell you, it's a little worse than this in occasions. So what does the world look like? What is the world in perspective of informal property? It really looks like this. 70% of the world population lives under and works under illiquid and informal property. And that really translates to about $9 trillion, about twice the money supply of the United States today. Now, you have to realize that it's not a binomial reaction, right? It's not black or white. It's not something that you see in one space and you don't see it in another. It's not, in other words, defined, informal property is not defined for the South and formal for the North. Or developed countries don't have it, but developing countries have it. That's absolutely not the case. It has no boundaries. It doesn't identify itself as an ethnical phenomenon or a cultural phenomenon. You find it everywhere, and recently it permeates most of our developing and developed countries. You'll be surprised how much informality we have in the South Bronx, for example, in the United States of America. Now, we note, however, that most of our markets, I mean, you can't really have a market unless that functions reliably and so on, unless it is based on a proper right, a right that has been emitted securely and it is enforced securely. And the only way this right can be emitted and enforced securely is if a property rights system is in place in the specific market and country that emits the right securely, and that means cheaply enough, effectively enough, efficiently enough, on time, in other words, and there is no problem of enforcing it. It is also, however, true that most of us economists that have been educated in the West, as well as those who have been educated outside of the West, traditionally we get trained to believe that property rights are assumed. They're already there. Markets already operate with property rights and institutions. Therefore, we take them for granted. We don't pay very much attention to that. I mean, I never was taught much about other than transaction costs are pretty much zero, and we talk in a perfect world situation usually. In such case, when we're dealing with distressed markets, we usually focus the reason of distressed markets in income disparities. So we usually say that if we're dealing with a distressed community, the reason is that we have income disparities and as a result, income inequalities. My premise, however, in the book and in my work is that distressed markets are really a result of wealth disparity. Income disparity is an outcome of the wealth disparity. And wealth disparity, I mean those who have versus those who do not have. But bear in mind, it's not those who have in terms of, money, and those who don't have in terms of money. Instead, it's those who have the security of their property and the security of their wealth that they can bank on versus those who do not have that security of their wealth. They still live in a home, they still have a lot, but they don't feel secure about it. And that is exactly what makes a distinction between formal and informal property owners. Illiquid versus liquid property. Now, what actually creates that wealth disparity is, of course, we have to go back and understand what generates the problem. It's usually a broken property rights system. So broken property rights system lead to unreal estate. Now I'm explaining a little better what unreal estate means. Unreal estate means basically, although it's tangible, you can see it, and you assume that it will have the value that you expect, it is not really liquid. It is not really used for the expected value that you would have thought so. Now, think about it. As I said, you can find informal property both in the developed and the developing world, and it's not a binomial phenomenon. It's not like you are formal or you're not formal, or you live on formal or you live on informal property. There is an overall scheme there is an overall spectrum of informality, which starts from the absolute illiquid property, and then you have variations to semi-illiquid, semi-formal, informal, and then the absolute formal. I'll go through these pictures later, for example. So this is the utmost informal, illiquid, based on water. That's pretty much the oxymoron I continue to use. This is exactly where Hernando de Soto is building most of his work, in the absolute informal property. There is very little market over here, very little trust, just tribal, as my friend Michael would say. Very, very connected to your family, and that would be it. I think this house, it's so precarious, it will not even live through one generation to the next, right? So you don't really have inheritance rights there either. You just survive through the day. Now then, you can go further to Africa. This was actually, that would have been a nice test to ask you, a nice quiz, if you knew where each one of these pictures would be. I'll ask you afterwards, and I'll give you another 10% discount on the book. Okay, so this is how in Southeast Asia, and this is in Africa, in Burkina Faso. Believe it or not, we are dealing with commercial property over there. This is actually a place where people fix their bikes and bicycles, and next to it, there's a house, as a matter of fact. Then in the same village further down, there is a bit of a market. So we're moving further from the family to a bit of a community market. And then we go to Latin America, where we actually have the emergence of community and settlements. Rather precarious, I would say, but they grow in their evolution. This is actually really a fascinating picture. This shows the development of the community in one of the South American countries I worked. This blue thing, it's called an igloo, and it is the first home of a newly wedded couple. And if people have too much to deal with bureaucracy and they don't want to get married, just live together, that's whatever you want to call it for whatever couple you want to call it. They live together, they go live there. They don't have much money, so they will usually buy one panel of straw. It's called a straw panel. It's what you see further up. They only buy one, they curve it, and then they insulate it with this blue little cover. And their door is another blue little, plastic thing. That lasts for about a year, and then they make a little more savings, and then they buy 3 more other straw panels. In the city where I took this picture, it's in the coast of Peru. It doesn't rain very much during the whole year, so they don't really care to have a roof. So just 4 panels is enough. And then on you start having, a little bit of wood, and maybe one day you're really serious and you buy, cement blocks and you start building with a cement block. Now that, however, does not mean that these people do not know to whom their land belongs. They purchase their land, and if you see here, you have demarcations. This is one demarcation, and these little stones that you see around is another demarcation. Each plot is very well defined, and they are listed with the owners in their community leaders. Now you go further into the development, and we notice these are 2 countries that are rather rich. Greece on the left, Venezuela on the right. And you can see the distinction when I'm talking about informal property, right? They build without realizing that a light bulb is going to go through their veranda. Did you notice that? All right. So no Greek coffee for those guys buying this apartment unit on their veranda. You may get electrocuted. And then we go to Eastern Europe, where we have abandoned homes, because we have this distinction of the home having belonged, or the apartment building or the apartment complex belonging or built during the communist time and belonging to the state, but the land was restituted to specific different owners. So this plot may have 3 owners on that piece of land. Now, how are they going to handle the building that was actually built later on in the timeline by the state, and now again later on, which is now, the state restitutes the land but doesn't know really what to do with the property. A mess. And we continue with a mess right here, which is Bulgaria and Palestine, Ramallah. This is a very interesting picture I found. This is actually the newly developed area, the capital of the city. These two buildings are ministries. And please check the goats here. Do you see these two little goats? That's why the lights needed to be a little dim. These little goats are over there, and right at the root, right at the corner, right at the edge, you also have some other animals for whatever use. So you have this kind of mixed rural, urban, agriculture, all of it together, and policymaking at the same time. All at once. And of course, we go to my neck of the woods, Washington, D.C., where we all think everything is so formal and liquid and all of that, and that jazz does not really apply. This is another part of property right in the center of the city, and it's abandoned because we don't know what to do with it, and they're next to it as well. Yet next to because there is lack of ownership in terms of we don't know to whom it belongs, and next to it is a beautiful, I don't know which period's church. So really, the extremes are real. You have fully informal all the way from the one end, and you move to absolutely formal at the other end. Now, if you think about it, if you are informal, like a country of the first pictures I showed you, getting from the informal stage, illiquid stage, pure liquid stage, to some sort of developed stage, which is the Venezuela-Greece stage, right? And you're semi-informal. Even parts of the US are like that. It's almost easy, believe it. It's not difficult to actually go there. When it becomes really difficult is to push that frontier and move it to the pure formal frontier. The countries that belong to the formal frontier would be Australia, Eastern Canada, Denmark, New Zealand. Why would that be the case? Because right there, you don't really have very much of a market, and you don't have very many players who would not want to have a reform. Once you're already here, you already have a little bit of a market, and you have a set of players and interests and professional groups that become really insular and do not allow any entry of reforms because they're making rent of themselves, of their own. They have their own incomes. These in here are in civil code countries. The guardians of the old system are usually notary publics of the civil code countries. I don't know how many of you come from a civil code country, but not Central America, but South America and Europe are very strong there. Okay, so there are, of course, I alluded to it, but there are, therefore, impacts. So broken property rights system create informality. And what do we forgo with informality? Why is it so problematic? Maybe it's nice and cute to be a little informal. I mean, what's the problem, really? There are severe impacts in 3 domains: in the economic sphere, social, and environmental. In the economic sphere, the biggest distortion, the one that underlines absolutely everything, is the fact that the asset is purely fragile. It's insecure, and as a result, it generates distortions in the valuations of the property. So you suddenly can have really skyrocketing prices, speculative upgoing prices, and the same type of force that brings prices up brings prices down as well. You see, a property rights system, what it does, it records the supply of the land that is out there to be used for whatever the town or the country wishes to zone them for. If you don't have this supply and you have little holes in your whole property rights system, you end up having a ratio that is not, with a denominator that is not easily defined. I can explain that a little later if you like. So you end up having distressed property markets, you end up having a lot of illiquidity of savings. So imagine these people that own this property but are rather insecure. They still, though, are the places where they're going to build their little home. So what do they build with? Their own savings. They invest on their homes. But these homes are not really fully bankable. So we do have a huge amount of illiquidity of savings, and we do notice a very big percentage of labor immobility. So people tend not to want to move out of this place and find a better job somewhere else for a variety of reasons. The most prevailing one is that if they are insecure about their property, it is very possible that when they come back home, it may be taken over by their neighbor or by another foreign, entity. In Eastern Europe, in my original country in Greece, or in countries, Portugal, places where people immigrated a lot, Italy, they immigrated, came to the States, left their lands behind for a better future. They went back 10 years later, 5 years later, only to find that their lands were squatted by the neighbors or sold by their inherited the lines of their own cousins, or God knows what. And then it's a huge, big problem for them to claim it back. They have to go through courts, and then, you can lose your property in these countries even if you don't fly to the US for a better future. You just stick around there. Imagine if you have flown away. So then we also notice a very, very weak capital market, obviously. Because you don't really have a security, you can create a bond out of a derivative, a serious derivative, not the ones we have been dealing with recently. And of course, we notice some serious, inefficient development of infrastructure and utilities and so on. And much more, the list is long. In social distortions, this is actually an interesting aspect. You see, we economists that have worked in promoting development in the world, the mantra is usually to promote sustainable development. But as I told you earlier, we were not really geared and wired to understand the lack of institutions, to understand the fact that societies, people, us, we operate with contractual arrangements that are not fully represented in the legal systems. So do we really produce sustainable development, or do we just patch? I would claim we patch. And what happens is if we don't really tackle the problem of insecurity of property rights and the problem of insecurity of institutions, we don't really have sustainable development. We keep on repeating ourselves, and you can see it in every single country we work with. You will see, like in every about 20 years, we go back and repeat, macroeconomic adjustments, fundamentals, again, the same old to repeat it over and over again. And surprisingly enough, every 20, 25 years, the government say, for the first time, we're doing this. And if somebody has lived enough to see what happened 25 years ago or 20 years ago, they say, what first time? It just the same language occurred before. So really what we're having is sustainable poverty. And we're having enduring poverty. And of course, social disorder and violence and corruption and criminality. And I just came from Guyana, where I was robbed. And of course, it can happen every place, but you can really walk out there on your own for more than 4 minutes without really setting all alarms off. Ask them how secure do they feel about their property, and they're going to tell you absolutely insecure to the highest degree. They can even get a title and an ownership certificate issued to them by a judge. It can be revoked at any time. So it is a pure insecurity there, and it generates a higher level of lawlessness, anomie. The same thing applies in Albania. The same thing applies in Russia. The same thing applies in other parts of the world. Another very important point is, in Peru, when I was working there, I hadn't noticed that I wasn't expecting prior to doing this reform that I would actually be touching something really, really sensitive, child labor. The moment we secured property rights, child labor was reduced by 28%. An extraordinary figure. My eyebrows were like raised, and I thought, wow, this is really exciting. This is more exciting than I thought. Let's continue. Okay, so let's continue indeed. Middle class. Imagine that we have the haves and the have-nots, and an institutional structure that is so weak and fluid, and anything goes, and whoever has, the power right there and then establishes their rights. Who usually gets squeezed out? The middle class. So you tend to have the middle class be either expatriating the country or really impoverishing themselves. And also we notice that usually the wealth pool is not participated by women and minorities. It is something we note, as well as the fact that there is a very weak political participation from these minorities and women as well. We notice immediately the change the moment we have a reform. Now, on the environmental distortions, imagine more efficient waste management systems the moment that this property belongs to you. The common areas of the community are now shared. And we note that we have less land quality degradation. For instance, before the reforms in Peru, people used to irrigate endlessly, destroying the contents of the soil of the land, because endless irrigation, continuous irrigation, not specialized drip irrigation, would actually increase the salt content of the land, meaning that these farmers had to become nomads after a while and move out of there and go to another piece of property. That actually people became more conscious of their asset, of their own investment, and they started taking care of it much more than before. And of course, there is a better management of carbon footprint. Now, of course, you're sitting here. I showed you the beautiful video. It took me forever to put it together. And you're going to tell me, so what is the result? What is the solution? What are we going to do? But of course, transform, right? We're going to move from the liquid to liquid, right? It's one word, transform. Why don't we do it? How can we do it? So that's what you're going to read in the book. How can you do transformation? And it's a very small book, but you need to probably read it a couple of times because it's not very. It's not a difficult book to read, but it's not your everyday common type of reading that you would have. What is the litmus test for a successful transformation? 3 key elements: vision, rigor, trust. Vision, very important. Not in the words, not in the flopping of the politician's mouth, in the actual action. You do need to have a politician who is going to be putting political will into wanting to reform. How do you show that political will? With the rigor of actions. So I took a plane yesterday coming to LA. If the pilot had changed his mind and wanted to actually stop at Kansas, this would not have been a rigorous policy. It would have landed at Kansas and not in LA. So, political will, you want to go to LA, rigor, you get on the plane, you get the right pilot that is going to take you there safely, timely, and effortlessly, really. You just get in, you go there. The same type of reforms. What we notice I've worked in more than 30 countries. They really want to do changes. They really want to do reforms. They invite me over and say, yes, of course. Let's meet with the Minister of Finance. If you talk to the Prime Minister, he wants you to meet with the Minister of Finance. And then if you talk to the Minister of Finance, he wants you to meet with the other very important people. And they all say all these wonderful things, everything you want to hear. You kind of like go, wow, great, these people really want to do these things. And then nothing happens. You're sitting around and they're pushing paper and they're moving it back and they say, the reality of this country is really difficult. You can't really change things. Well, you know what? No one would have even been here right now listening to me, and I wouldn't have been here talking to you if the reality so many years back would have been whatever. They would not have allowed us to do anything. You set up goals, you go for them. And that's exactly what a politician needs to do. Why? The third, you see they're connected one with the other. Trust. That is the only way you can establish trust between your parties. That is the only way the 3 most important parties that are the absolute necessary key ingredients to your policy reform, government, citizens, and the private sector, the people who actually give you the dough, right? All three need to partner. If they don't trust you that you're there for good and you really want to do that change and you have the rigor to go about it, they won't support it. So we notice, as I said, many of the development gurus that go around, write a new law, go to, I don't know, I'll give you an example. We go to the Czech Republic, write a new law, walk back, and say, but it's unenforceable. No one is using it. But a law is nothing else than a product of the country. Assume that the only product the government produces is laws. Everything else can be outsourced. Now, if you were a private company and you produced a product that no one would buy it, would you continue producing it? You would be running out of business, right? So, but because we're a monopoly as a government, we keep on producing laws. And then it's the fault of the people who do not, follow them. So you produce a product, the clients are not, the purchasers are not purchasing it. It's their darn fault, man. They don't get it. They should buy it. Think about that logic. It's very, very similar. It's very linear and it's very simple. And if you put it down on those terms, that's when people actually start getting it. So how do you go about it? First thing, after you're getting the fact that there is political will and so on, do we understand that the asset is, do we understand that the asset is very unique? Oh, that's wrong. Wrong English. You don't say very unique. Forgive me. Erase it, please. The asset is unique in the following sense. It has both social and economic characteristics. It has social characteristics because it's a shelter. There is only one globe. We cannot mutate our land. We cannot have a second globe, right? That's why we have all these fights as well. So we have one piece of property and it shelters us. But it's also an investment. It's also an economic good. So you can separate the two. You can't just have policies for investment derivatives and so on and forget the fact that you have first homeowners. And then you cannot just think of policies for first homeowners and forget the fact that this property can actually be an investment. There is a immediate first loss right away. Secondly is you have to right away when we start doing the analysis of what is going on right now, we need to realize all the baggage that poor little property market has been carrying around. Baggage does not only come with our relationships. I'm sorry to say, they come with a lot of things we're trying to work with. Our lives is a set of projects. So if you do start working in a project of or understanding what is really going on in the country, you have to untangle it and see where everything actually came from and how do we end up being in the mosaic we are today. This is a little cartoonish sketch of what happened in Peru. In Peru in 1990, I was seeing a country that had alive traditions of the people in the field, right, of the actual communities that were Inca traditions, straight from the Inca. They spoke Aymara and Quechua. They didn't speak Spanish. And these people were owners, and they were citizens, and they were voters. Thank you. Secondly, we were noticing laws that were still alive and existing, and traditions from the colonial times of the 1800s. Then we saw also reminiscences and existing institutions that were coming from the dictatorship of the 60s and the nationalizations of the 70s and the privatizations of the 80s. And suddenly in 1990, we were called to do changes. Unless you understand all that, what is that you're missing if you wouldn't do it? If you wouldn't do what I call this reality check analysis, you would miss an actual good solution designed today because you would miss who would actually be the parties that you're dealing with. At every given point in history that you had as breaks that I just presented, each break was producing winners and losers, winners and losers, winners and losers. And basically you ended up having, in the timeline of today, the present, all these collective losers and all these collective winners. And all of them wanted a stake of your reforms today. Some of them are latent, are not obvious. Some of them are really obvious. It is super important before you go into a game, understand the rules of the game, and actually try to understand them, define them in a way, because it's not very clear. It's a little bit like FBI work. And you thought economics is boring. So that's what you do. You start with identifying the problem, that's reality check analysis, and you isolate the problem. You don't put everything together. It's not a Christmas tree. And you check throughout time, and that's what I'm trying to do here. We start from the initial time of the creation of the market, and we go around and we try to find out historical breaks. Each historical break defines who were the winners and the losers at the time, because they become lobbies, they become unions. And then you're able today to diagnose, yes, of course, I am able to do a change, and I will do it by creating a design solution that would make sense. No, it doesn't make sense to do a change right at this moment. And I did talk to you about the fact that this would allow, the third point is, that would allow us to understand the interests of the winners and the losers, and would allow us to identify how we can partner with them. Because it builds trust, as I said before, and that is the most important triangle. Please keep it in mind. If nothing else, keep this in mind. It's super important. You cannot do a reform by aligning the private sector with the government and just talking to the citizens, just announcing to them what you're doing. Because they cut deals right behind your back, and they just don't buy your laws. They don't buy them. They won't buy them. We are smart beings. We don't have to go for MBAs at extraordinary universities like this one to actually become smart beings. People have innately smart, optimal decision-making processes. If they don't feel there is a benefit in engaging in a specific behavior, they will not engage in the specific behavior unless they are really forced to do so. And forcing somebody to engage in a specific behavior is a not sustainable way of actually reaching growth. The same thing applies if you're a government. That's usually dictatorships. You're a government and you align with some of the citizens, some of the leading citizens, but then you forget the private sector, and then you flee. You have capital fleeing out of your country. Latin America in the 80s. So I'll tell you very fast, in the next 5 minutes, the Peru story, which was what happened very quickly. And I'll tell you the story through the case of Margarita. Margarita is a woman I met in 1990. She was a seamstress, a very sweet woman. She was worth $80 a month. And today she's worth several thousands. As a matter of fact, she's no longer just a seamstress. She's exporting. She's exporting cotton textiles to this beautiful country of ours, the United States. How did it all happen? In 1990, I tried to untangle that cartoonish figure I was showing to you earlier, and what we were dealing with was hyperinflation, super extraordinary crisis, default of the country in its sovereign debt, joblessness, 70% of informality. 70% of the people did not feel secure. Now, if you have a market where 70% of the players don't feel secure, do you think the 30% feel secure? I mean, the minority cannot feel secure when the majority feels insecure, right? It's very unstable. So what happened is, with a small investment of only 60 million, we managed to get a multiple of 200 in only 3 years. So what did we do? We reduced the number of agencies from 14 to 2. So an individual who had to go, the property rights system, was engaged with 14 different bureaucratic agencies. And we just basically simplified them to only 2, eliminated all 12. Instead of an individual having to pay $7,000 and having to spend 7 years, and by 7 years I mean 365 days times 7. That's what I mean, like count every single day, 7 years. Remember I said, why would somebody do that? And now it took 2 days, it still takes 2 days, only $14 and no more intermediaries. If any of you is from South America, intermediaries are called tramitadores, which we don't have them anymore. So that's where she lived, Margarita. These were her three kids, sorry. That's what I had to deal with. And I can still see. I didn't lose my sight. And that's what the technical guys had to deal with. So when we got all the maps and handled all the legal maze, you would have people who lived in these lots for years and years, and so did their families. And the lots were actually part of a bigger feudal estate that was registered in the registry, still existing, still legal, in the late 1800s. So we had to go all the way back and structure the transfer of this property. We had to work in the field, and still do. None of these people felt the need. Now you realize this is not, it is the initiation of the reform, right? It's the first stage, which means you involve everybody in, and then they learn, they can know how to go back into the organizations. So you had to go there. This lady over there was a woman talking to and collecting information from the owners. Very difficult to get the trust of the individuals. Very difficult. They wouldn't really feel comfortable to talk to a government entity. And of course, this is Margarita and her husband, super excited. Look at her smile. I couldn't believe it myself. When she came with her husband, as a matter of fact, she was at the hospital the day before, and she had to leave earlier from the time that the doctor was suggesting, because she could not leave let go of that extraordinary ceremony that took about 2 days, and God knows what. It was super exciting for all of them. Now, this is a picture, but at that time, now the house is looking so much better. So this was the jump of properties, of people. In 95, we had about 1.5 million. And now we are over 10 million people. So the middle class was consolidated. And these are the returns that we're talking about. And I would be happy to share those slides with you. The level of security increased by about 98% or so. Child labor was reduced by 28%. Cottage industries was reduced by about 50%. What does that mean? Cottage industry means that people that were working in their own homes with their children were no longer working in their homes. They took their profession outside together with others who had the similar profession. So Margarita went and worked with other seamstresses and other guys and created something like a warehouse in the middle of their neighborhood. Labor mobility increased, investment increased, and property values increased significantly. And then another 2-minute case, the one of the U.S., where Deborah Thomas, a lady that was really worth just a welfare check, that's her. She was able to transform the property of her condominium and also the adjacent ones of the whole block. That's in chapter 5, I believe. And gave each one independent the ability to have their ownership. And so how can we have a success story? And this is my conclusion. You have a success story because you understand the problem of informality. It's a learning process. As I said, it's a relationship. You get into it and it grows on you. And then you have to also understand partnerships and engage them. So this triangle I mentioned, super important. Keep them always, all the time in. And use reality check analysis to untangle what is going on. The moment you see the problem, you don't really see the history. You don't see how many cadavers you will actually be dealing with when you open that little, whatever it is, that box. And please do get involved. And that's all I had to say for today. Thank you very much for your patience. Oops.
great pleasure to, it's a great pleasure to be able to discuss this very interesting presentation, both as a fellow institutional economist and a philo-Hellene. Two of my happiest years in my life were spent in Greece, and I love the Greece ever since. So Elena, in this wonderful presentation, shows how she has very successfully built on and extended the analysis of Hernando de Soto, who is the author of those two famous books, the one she mentioned about Mystery of Capital and also The Other Path that he had written earlier. And in that Mystery of Capital, he did, towards the end, suggest exactly what she's picked up on, and that is that you need to, in order to deal with informality, we need to, and where there aren't really property rights that can be enforced, we really understand that property, got to carefully investigate the circumstances and see what can be done. And she has really built on that, formalized it in the book. I'm sorry, I have this key chapter in the book. So it involves titling authority, registration, the state capability in maintaining property records, a functional judicial system, and corruption, in dealing with corruption from above. So she very nicely explained the tremendous variability in informality for the whole span, going from informality, these wonderful pictures, going from complete informality to formality. So the circumstances are different in lots of different settings. And it's also, she showed very clearly that it's not just developing countries versus developed countries. We see this even within developed countries, we see this span of the range between formal and informal. These concepts of illiquid capital, unreal estate, and so on, these are very, and then the inspiring transformations of these individuals like Margarita, which is so nicely described. I also applaud her critique for my own discipline of economics for its tendency to assume that property rights are complete, well enforced, transaction costs don't exist, and indeed I think that is the major shortcoming in neoclassical economics. But economics has been working hard to overcome those critiques in recent years. She also showed, I think very appropriately, that institutions can outlive their circumstances. So those laws that were the colonial laws in Peru are no longer appropriate in the 20th century. So we see the need for reforms. But reforms are problems. How to overcome the obstacles of reforms, given that there are likely to be people that lose from the reforms. How do you align the interests of the potential losers so that it can be a win-win situation for everyone? So this, she extended this reality check analysis. I won't repeat all that. I thought that was very enlightening and a very nice way to go, going into this idea that Hernando de Soto had, but in much greater detail and depth. And then she has applied these concepts and the vision and rigor and trust around the world in all these different circumstances. And I applaud her for that, for being kind of an activist, taking to the field with these ideas, not just stopping at the writing a book or presenting lectures and so on, but really trying to affect the real world. So it's also the case that I'm very happy, I have on my reading list the article by Erica Field, who did her dissertation on this titling project. And indeed, maybe it's her numbers that you're using.
She used our statistics, so we gave them to her.
Oh, she gave it to her. Because her study showed precisely that the titling program in Peru, it decreased the probability that there will be a child working by 28% and shifting this the labor supply from inside the household to outside the household. So those statistics are borne out. I don't know the circumstance more recently, but it's also true that people have used the same, other economists have built on the same ideas, and for example, in Brazil, and showed that cycling seems to have a big effect in reducing violence and murders and all sorts of crimes. So this is ideas are going places, and they're very powerful, and what can be done. Now, I've just raised some questions. Some limits on the Peruvian miracle. So even after 15 years of this program, with quite sizable resources, and I know that at least the background of this, I think the Fujimori administration put a fair amount of money into these programs. I think the World Bank has assisted. It sounded like a little more than the 60 million that was cited. But after these 15 years, Peru still ranks number 91 on the Property Rights Alliance Index for property rights. 91 out of a total of 115. And the countries like India, Colombia, Bulgaria, Mauritania, Morocco, not countries you think of as optimal in property rights, they're all ranked at least 40 places above Peru on this list. The IPRI indexes, even for Latin America, Peru is still about a standard deviation below the average for Latin America. And as far as I could tell, the only countries in Latin America that are lower on this index, the really great index, if somebody's looking for an index property right, I think this is the best. This group that all comes out of the De Soto background is the best index of property rights that's ever been developed. Unfortunately, it only goes back to 1997 or to 2007. There's 2009, but Peru is still, as I say, about a standard deviation below the Latin America average. In Guyana, Paraguay, Nicaragua, and Bolivia are the only countries in Latin America that have lower scores on this index than Peru. It's less than half of the score of Finland, which is the top country on the list. So I would like to know a little bit more about the cost-benefit analysis. It's the 60 million. I don't know exactly what that pertained to, but that seemed like a low number for what I would have guessed for all these years and the program. And so is it really, is this the most cost-effective way? So as laudable as it is it the most cost-effective way to really improving conditions in these areas of Latin American cities? The third point is about, would it not be, she cited how these things come about in some cases. You've had communist governments that have nationalized the property. You've had people that have fled under civil wars and so on. So would it not have been be better to really focus on the causes of these problems by trying to make it harder for any governments and civil wars to arise and so on, put our resources in avoiding these things that have really caused this problem. I know, having lived in Lebanon for times, that every time the Israelis would invade the south, there would be all these refugees coming into Beirut and squatting on people's land. So would it not be easier and more cost-effective to somehow stop that has led to lots of problems where these things haven't been resolved and the courts are all backed up? How permanent are the improvements in titling? For example, I wonder whether, so the period I think that was used to investigate the improvements on the reduction in child labor were periods where Peru was growing quite fast, came out of the bleak period that Elena described. And then there was relatively rapid growth for quite a while. But is it not possible that there would be backsliding in some of these measures when things got bad and households started to drop into poverty to a greater extent? The costs of failure. So I gather not every case is a success story around the world in going into this, and I'm sure Elena has borne the scars of this, of being disappointed that she can't find these leaders that will really take up the challenge and follow through with it. So if you add up all of the cases, the cost benefit might look a little bit worse than it does in just from looking at the success stories themselves. The sixth point is about the one thing that didn't come out so much in Elena's presentation, but a number of the authors that contribute to this importance of putting priority on property rights, to me they miss the boat a little bit, and that they tend to emphasize private property rights at the exclusion of common property rights. And we just had a Nobel Prize winner in economics, Elinor Ostrom, that won the Nobel Prize for her contributions to showing how common property rights can be very effective and can deal with very complex problems that maybe even private property rights can't deal with. And then finally, my final point is that property rights are not the only institutional problem that needs to be fixed. There are many others. There are gender empowerment, opening to globalization, with all sorts of reforms that are needed, other types of capital market development, schooling, how to provide incentives to schools to have high-quality education, and education that caters to all segments of society, not just final. Just an advertisement for tomorrow. Erica Field, the person that wrote this dissertation about the piping boom, is presenting a paper tomorrow afternoon in our department, over in the Department of Economics in Caprillion Hall, 4 p.m. Thank you.
Well, as predictably, we have run out of time. The good news about that is that I probably would have to give a long discussion role in place of Mr. Richardson, but I do want to make a couple of points and then one question. The properties are not, actually they're not never in a vacuum. Somebody owns the property. Either it belongs to the government or to the private, or if you go to the Middle East, there are properties, the land belongs to the elite, the public, the government, or the private. So when the squatters move into property, either they're squatting on somebody's property that somebody already owns, or they're squatting on public property, or the government property, or maybe the common property. So you know, in Ahmedabad, there are squatters on the river bank, or in places like in Brazil, that's the World Bank got involved in earlier work. They were basically squatting on land that is basically inhabitable in these sort of floodplains. So the Dharavi slum in Mumbai, which is the largest slum in the world, and the question is, how did that slum got so big? Well, the reason the slum is there because the land was just a floodplain, a mangrove, and basically inhabitable land. Now the squatters moved in there. They became formal communities and things like that. And now that land is very attractive because it's right in the middle of the city. So now they want to figure out how to sort of get rid of the squatters, slum dwellers, and then and this process is going on. So the question is, how do you sort of achieve that? Now there's some interesting innovations taking place, like in Cambodia and places where they finally, the developers who own the private land, they say, well, you know, the transaction cost, because of the paperwork, fortunately for the red tape, the government bundle of paper, that it's best to make a deal with the squatter that will give you 10% of the land, resettle you, and giving you the full property rights, and owned about the 90% of the land, and it still will come out ahead. And the same kind of thing is going on in the Dharavi situation. The question about what role the government plays, the market plays, is an interesting one. And for example, if you don't talk about the real property as first and region fund, there are other kinds of property rights. When Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India, she nationalized the banks. Having nationalized the banks, she had the right to ask every bank to finance these rickshawalas, and so something that wouldn't have happened before. The private bank wouldn't give the loan to this rickshawala who doesn't have any equity at all. But in order to do that, the government had to become the national income bank, which is not a very pleasant scene in many places. But in that case, the government really moved to act, form that kind of institutional change that's necessary. And so the rickshawalas, they're still pulling the rickshaw, they're paying the same rent they used to pay the rickshaw to the syndicate when they used to rent them. But at least this time they're getting an equity. So after 2 or 3 years, they actually own the rickshaw. Now that is a very important form of property ownership. They're probably still be living in squatter settlements, but at least they have some kind of a property ownership through which, based on which they can get loans and things like that. So the other question that I have for Elena, I don't know if the real property is the right place to begin in terms of solving the problems of poverty, in terms of transferring, that maybe there are other forms of property rights that could be easily transferred than the illiquid property of the real estate. Because the real estate, I think, is much more complicated and more expensive. So eventually somebody will have to pay. So if the government decides to give the property rights to the owners, as they have done in Brazil, and other World Bank examples, government could put the bill. And it is also telling that sites and services program the World Bank ran very successfully in the 80s and 90s. The countries were not interested in sites and services program because basically the sites and services program were freezing desirable land, urban land, and so the countries were not interested. So that program is now out of the window. So I wouldn't take any more time. I think there are some other questions, and let's start the discussion.
Can I give you like 4 seconds to the answers? Thank you so much for loving my country. I love it too. It doesn't happen all the time that you love your country, but I'm really I'm a very lucky woman because I have 2 loving countries. I have Greece and the U.S. It's an amazing, many times you don't have that. Okay, it ranks 91. There are a lot of property rights index out there, and I understand that you like very much this one. But what is, I think, really important to see is the delta and see where it was before and where is it now. And it hasn't changed at all. The cost-benefit analysis is strictly based on the $60 million that we gave, and the $60 million were all together, the government of Peru and the 18 million from the government of Peru and the rest from us. And this is the chapter 5 shows exactly the changes we saw on the 60 million, right? I think your question now is a cost-benefit overall. All right, second book. Right now, I cannot deal with so much. Private versus common. No problem at all. I don't have any problem with common property rights. I don't have any problem with private property rights. My point is, can we just establish a set of rules that everybody follows? And the only way you can establish a set of rules that Paul Romer talks about, the only way you can establish a set of rules that everybody follows is if these rules are trusted by those who create them and those who are to enforce them and those who are to use them. That's it. So common, private, public, it's all fine with me. As a matter of fact, in Africa we use a lot of common, and especially also in Latin America, in the Amazonic region where there are tribes, right? But we give them the common property right so they can at least enforce them the right against the rest of even unless against expropriation of the government. Erica Fields tomorrow, 4 o'clock. I'm at UCLA, but if you would like and you wouldn't mind, I would love to come over and listen to her. And other institutional problems are not the only ones, I agree. I look at, and this one I will respond to you as well, in your land being is property. Okay, Adam Smith talked about the two major factors of production. In chapter 1, I talk about it, I think, land and labor. And you initiate economic growth with agricultural economy and the human who actually, works this agricultural economy. So you have Hume talking about the importance of being able to have the rights of disfrutar, of taking out and using the fruits of your own labor. Then we go to the Industrial Revolution, where land turns into capital. So we have an additional factor of production. Many of these countries are still in the land, the agricultural evolutionary element of their economy, but they are trying to compete in the global world in a very developed industrial world, and they have this link, they have this missing link. How can they move institutionally from land to the Industrial Revolution and then therefore capital? It's what I mentioned to you earlier. There was a communist revolution in Eastern Europe. Then they came back. They built all these beautiful buildings, and this was a factory. And then, it was what I showed you were the places where the factory workers were living. Then they go back to separate the plot and go and give justice to the previous owners. And then they're in a mess. So that's a little bit the situation. Now, not all countries are ready for a reform. This is not a panacea. This is not like, as I said, you may have the vision, but you may not have the rigor. You may have, as a private entrepreneur, the first thing I do is I try to find out if there is a reform appetite. You may be hungry, but not hungry for salmon. You may be hungry, but hungry for something else. So you need to figure this out, and you can't stuff it under people's throats. Squatters, private squatters. What I noticed with squatters in most countries I went to is that the squatters that we concede and perceive as squatters, they have actually purchased the land from land traffickers. And they are triple times victims. One by the land trafficker because they purchased the land under the table. They don't have any legal document. They don't have any formal document. They have these little pieces of paper that they hold, and they have their names that they actually put all this money. But then they are now also victims from the formal state who calls them squatters, and victims from us who continues to engage them as if they are. And yes, indeed, they are. And they fit into this whole problem and appetite for reform. Is the government ready to handle it? Because as a policy analyst and as somebody who goes there to provide some sort of an institutional solution, you cannot do it unless there is an internal acceptance of it. So further questions. Did I answer more or less? Because I understand you don't have much time.
Yeah, let's take some questions.
Thanks very much. It was very illuminating. I have a question about definition. When you say property rights, do you mean strictly title? A real property, not personal property. Because my difficulty is that we have institutionalized right of enjoyment through contract. So we have renters and people who lease real property.
Right of enjoyment through contract.
Yeah, because in the States at least, rental housing is an institutional vehicle. Is it appropriate to consider it a contributor to social stability and economic development?
Rent?
A rental agreement, is it equal to the title to the property in terms of stability?
It is, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. It's not, the rental agreement is already one step away from the owning agreement. So the owner rents, right? In an informal structure, you don't even have the owner. So anything afterwards is continuing to be informal. So if I understand correctly, the rent itself, it's a usage of the original property right.
Simply that we have been advocating as a matter of social issue,
home ownership.
Well, that is a problem. I don't fully agree with it. Because it's, again, home ownership is perceiving, not understanding the animal, what type of an asset we're dealing with. Home ownership and promoting it and subsidizing it and pushing it and moving it and so on is looking at property only as shelter, not looking at property as an investment. You see? So then you push home ownership, but people want to, they don't even want to live there after a while. They want to move. They want to do other things. So what do? They sublet informally. You see? So you have to, individuals have to have abilities and freedom of choice, right? Any other question?
Okay, one last question, really. If not, then let's...
Thank you very much, guys.